So we've had a new agency established in July, and the role of the agency is to set up the basis for what will become the Net Zero Authority. The Net Zero Authority is a new government entity that is intended to do three things, at least at this stage. And so this is to help workers and communities adapt to the net zero transition. It's also to help identify investment opportunities in the net zero future and help coordinate across government. Now, one of the reasons that it's so important and so interesting is that Australia has been in a really difficult space on climate action, climate policy for the better part of a decade. It's meant that we've had a lot of debates that have reached stasis point on fairly symbolic aspects. Should Australia acknowledge the reality of climate change, commit to emissions reduction commitments, commit to emissions reductions? But now we're moving into the space of really tangible action. We're seeing the beginning of quite profound changes to the landscape, especially in regional Australia. We're seeing coal-fired power stations moving toward closure, shifts in the landscape for coal mining as well. At the same time, there's the expansion of distributed renewable energy. And so this is an opportunity to take a coordinated approach, and particularly to help those regional communities and the workers navigate what is going to be an uncertain time of change. So the idea of a just transition is this concept that suggests taking action on climate change shouldn't come at the expense of any particular person or community. It's a good idea. It is a complicated concept though. We often hear a bit of cynicism about just transition, especially from within resource communities. This includes the idea that the term just transition is a little bit of a cop-out, that people will say, we're going to make massive changes to regional communities, but it will be a just transition, so it's okay. I don't mean to suggest that that's the intent behind the term at all, but that really speaks to the fact that there are these underlying tensions. There's concern and there's distrust about whether regional communities are going to be supported through these times of uncertainty and change. So the sentiment here is that we really need to be looking at how is it that we can make sure nobody's left behind, and even better if this transition can help to make new bright futures for people, new opportunities into the future. So thinking about what it means in communities that often have a large dependence on coal as part of their economy means really looking at how is it that the economies can diversify, especially in the short term. And that doesn't mean finding something that will compete with coal or override it, but often something that can sit alongside it, that can expand the opportunities in the future for people. We know that the question of shifting a workforce from one industry to another is a much more complicated question than simply taking a person from one job and putting them into another. It's all the aspects of skills and training, the meaning that we take from our work, and of course, the salaries or the wages that we get paid as well. So this area of the just transition, even though I started off by saying it can be kind of a complex and fraught concept to move into, especially in regional Australia, it does actually have a lot of really important considerations packaged into it, which is largely about making sure we don't leave people behind as things change. Resource communities have really been literally at the coalface of these debates about climate action, what it means practically. One of the things that makes it so complicated is that when you live in places outside the cities, you often have much more direct exposure to natural resources. You live much more directly with the changes in the weather. It's the same in agricultural communities, see it in resource communities as well. And so when there's been debates about climate action, these have often led to kind of singular statements about the future of coal. Treat coal like a four-letter word, and it is a complex issue, and transitioning out of fossil fuels, if we listen to what the world's best scientists are telling us, it is really quite an urgent shift that probably needs to happen. But for people who live in these communities, they understand the complexity around a resource like coal, the difference between coal used for domestic purposes and coal that's exported, coal that's used to generate power versus coal that's used in steel production. And so hearing a really singular view on coal, on the future of this resource, can make it feel like the arguments for climate action are somewhat detached from reality. So the Net Zero Authority will have a great opportunity to intervene in this space that has become really complex. We can look to some past events like before the 2019 federal election, the Stop Adani Convoy protest movement. that was a perfect illustration of this idea that there's a massive gulf between the desires of the cities and the desires of the regions for climate change. But we've also seen a lot of polling that's indicated, some of my own research with Professor Frank Yotzo and Professor Kelly Fielding speaks to this as well, that actually when you go looking for a difference between what city people and country people think on climate change, it's actually quite hard to find a difference there. So a great opportunity for the Net Zero Authority will be to start to rebuild that trust, especially in the regions, to see that climate action, net zero transformation isn't something that is being imposed by cities on regional people. A really great way to do that is to genuinely empower the regions to find those local-based and locally relevant solutions. We're going to find that there are massive differences between what's relevant in places like Wagga, Muswellbrook, Tamworth, all around the country. And so for those to be developed in place, led by people who know the area, who know the people, who are connected through networks of volunteerism, through the schools, the sports groups, the religious groups, this is where we'll get that opportunity to really build a cooperative basis of support for this massive transformation that is happening in Australia. Well, it is a really important time, and the establishment of the Net Zero Authority, in my view, signals that we are shifting into a new phase on climate policy in Australia. It's not about if we should act, but it's how we act, how we manage this action that's happening. And so for all people that are moving in this space, advocates, policymakers, researchers, media, commentators, what's really important is to think about how can we move forward in a way that seeks to close some of these social divides that have been so difficult in Australia in the past. Part of that is really showing respect for people in these communities and also respect for their knowledge of their communities, that they do have great ideas, great connections, great capacity to lead change that's relevant to themselves. So moving forward, what I think we really need to be doing is focusing on how we can work together with diverse knowledges, with approaches that are place-based, place-led, and think about how we can support each other through a whole range of different ways of taking action as part of the net zero transformation.